Welcome to the Shade Chronicles, an anthology-style podcast featuring short works of fiction and serial prose, specifically with a sci-fi and horror flavor. Your hosts for the podcast are Derek Leftridge and Lawrence Trokey.
Hi, this is Derek Leftridge.
Hi, this is Lawrence Trokey, and thank you for spending your time with us. Let's get started with our first story.
Gorilla Position by Derek Leftridge. The character Sir Augustus returns to the backstage area covered in sweat, spit, and stale beer and rushes to a monitor to see the hero get his love and admiration from the fans back in the ring in the center of the auditorium. He smiles to himself, thinking he made himself a good foil to the good guy, Rampage Mac, since the fans are still cheering and screaming Rampage's name. However, even though Sir Augustus, real name Barney Blunken, is proud of his work in the ring tonight, the boss and promoter, Slim Sammy Torito, taps him on the shoulder, and before Barney can turn around, Slim questions, "Why do you make me so sad? Someone with your size and ability makes everything difficult out there to the point that someone has to carry you through the whole show. Why is that, Barney?" Slim puts one of his bony hands into his baggy trouser pockets and stares at Barney with his deep-set eyes, and runs the other bony hand through his thin, bottle-dyed hair as if he was a 25, not 68-year-old Fabio primping his long locks for the ladies. Barney replies, "Oh, Mr. Torito, I thought tonight was a good show, and I was supposed to look weak and awkward against Ram." Mr. Torito expounds, "Yes, you need to look weak so the fans can lose themselves in the wrestling match and have some disbelief, but what you did was horrible. Wait, do you want to be fired?" Barney interjects, "No, sir. It's just that Sir Augustus is not something I have passion for anymore, and unfortunately it is showing in my work. But I do have an idea to get me back to good." "Well, you better," Mr. Torito replies. "You better have a new character and direction all ready to go by next Tuesday, which is 3 days from now, or I will have to wave bye to you as you leave the promotion." Mr. Torito turns, adjusts his tie knot, and walks quickly to Barney's opponent this evening, Rampage Mac, who has come through the curtain to the backstage and greets him with a toothy fake grin. 3 days later, Barney gets in his rental car and begins the 2-hour drive to the next town for a show that happens to be in his hometown, and this stretch of highway is very familiar to Barney. During the drive, Barney begins to think about his grandmother and how she was an avid wrestling fan and was the main reason Barney got into the wrestling business. After his grandfather passed away, his grandmother, distraught and lonely, took Barney to his first live wrestling event in their hometown arena. Barney noticed that his grandmother was very animated during the event and knew all the wrestlers by name, even the low-end talent. She had been going to the wrestling shows for years and told Barney she was good friends with a few of the wrestlers. His grandmother told him she was a good friend of the promoter, Sammy Torito, and after his grandfather passed away, she mentioned she had a relationship with Torito. Barney always thought that was why he got his break in the business, even though he always felt uncomfortable tension between his grandmother and Mr. Torito. Barney was always told by his grandmother that their ancestors were originally from Egypt, and this is why Barney is dark-complected with a large pointy nose. Even though none of this has been proven, and the reasons are probably because of the low percentage of French and Italian in Barney's ancestry line, however, he never questioned his grandmother. This led him to create and plan out the wrestling character Marshu Tentu, who will be an Egyptian pharaoh type that carries an ancient canopic jar for his bad guy gimmick. He'll use the canopic jar by splashing liquid from it, water with red food coloring, in his opponent's face to neutralize them and of course give him a way to cheat to win. To complete the character, Barney needs to locate the prop, an ancient Egyptian container. But that is not something you can just get from a gas station or Barney abruptly slows down and quickly pulls into a parking lot he has been to before just outside of the town he grew up in. Barney quickly pulls into the lot because he notices a small shop in the strip mall, 2 doors down from the cleaners he used, that seems to sell antiques. Oddly, Barney does not remember going into this place, but feels it has been in the strip mall forever. After quickly parking his car as close as possible to the store, Barney gets out and briskly walks over to the antique store, apparently called Bring It Home, because it's spelled out on a sign above the door. Once inside, Barney sees a row of shelves filled with items. After a glance around, Barney's attention goes right to a beautifully designed canopic jar midway on a shelf 3 feet in front of him that has a name tag tied to it, with ironically the name Barney in thick black marker. Surprised and excited, Barney quickly reaches up to grab the canopic jar and nearly knocks a blue-colored box off the shelf in his rush that was sitting next to the jar. Once the jar is securely in his grasp, a voice from the direction of the counter at the other end of the room says, "Oh yes, that is an exquisite item." Later that evening, during a wrestling event at the local auditorium, the ringside announcers begin to do their best to tell backstories about wrestlers performing. Well, Night Range, the jar Marshu Tentu carries to the ring is called a canopic jar, and in ancient Egypt, they were used to preserve the organs of the owners for the afterlife, explains announcer Good Old Double D. Announcer Night Range replies, "Yuck. That sounds horrible. And I guess the red liquid that he likes to throw in the opponent's face from the jar is some ancient fluid or juice." "Wow, juice? That is an odd and repugnant explanation," Good Old Double D responds. "Oops, I see your college diploma showing again. Repugnant is one of those smart people words," Night Range comments back. As the match begins to get to the final minutes, or the go-home part of the scripted wrestling match, Barney, aka Marshu Tentu, slips out of the ring and grabs his canopic jar, takes out the cork, and dramatically drips some of the red liquid into his hand. At the same time, his opponent, Road Rage Crasher, makes his way over to him, grabs his left shoulder, and Marshu Tentu throws the liquid into Road Rage's face. He quickly begins to act like the liquid is burning his eyes, as planned, but then smoke begins to come from Road Rage's eyes, and he begins to yell loudly. Waving wildly and clawing at his face, Road Rage begins to run to the backstage area up the entrance area. Barney, confused but staying in character of Marshu Tentu, makes a creepy manic laugh about the episode, but is very concerned that either someone instructed his opponent to overreact or something has gone wrong. Staggering and screaming, Road Rage stumbles past the curtain that separates the backstage from the arena and drops to his knees with his face covered with his hands. Those in the area on the other side of the curtain, the crew, other wrestlers, and members of the staff, rush over to check on Road Rage. As he pulls his hands away from his still smoking face, his skin is stuck and looks to be melted to his hands. Seeing this, and in terrible pain, Road Rage makes a throaty gurgling scream, then goes silent. Half of his face is stuck to his hands, and his fleshless right eye and cheekbone is gruesomely visible. More crew members and promoter Sammy Torito rush up to Road Rage, and once they see what has happened, they call out for an ambulance. Back in the auditorium, while the horrible backstage incident is occurring, Road Rage's manager attacks Marshu Tentu, and they have a quasi-wrestling match for about a minute, ending when Marshu Tentu wins with a roll-up and a pin. Road Rage's manager rolls out of the ring and stumbles to the back area, trying to act as if they were stunned and scared. Once he gets on the other side of the curtain, known as the gorilla position to those in the business where reality meets fantasy, he quits the act and rushes over to where Road Rage is now lying on a stretcher. He begins to ask what happened and starts to explain what he actually saw at ringside. Marshu Tentu Barney keeps his crazy bad guy routine going, raises his hand in victory, yells at the crowd who is booing unmercifully, rolls out of the ring, and quickly goes to the curtain and to the backstage area. As soon as Barney is on the other side of the curtain, Slim grabs him and slams him up against a stack of cases and yells, "Is this your sabotage idea or your grandmother's?" "What do you mean? I'm not sabotaging anything. Why do you ask about my grandmother? You know she's been dead for some time," Barney replies. Slim looks down and away from Barney's eyes and loosens his grip, then says to nothing really. He doesn't know. Slim looks back up at Barney and says, "Of course, you would not do anything to hurt the business, or me because you're a loyal soul. But your grandmother, that's another discussion entirely." Slim moves away from Barney and sits on a crate. Barney, in shock, says to Slim, "What are you talking about? Whatever happened out there was a mistake. A freak accident. Nothing was planned, especially not by a dead woman." "Well," Slim looks meekly up at Barney, "I beg to differ. You see, your grandmother cursed me when I broke things off with her, and she said she would get back at me even from the grave." Barney stares at Slim and says, "You're crazy." Slim continues, "I might be, but my newest big star now has half a face. The future of this company was going to ride on Road Rage's back. Now that he is no longer a matinee idol, we might be out of business. And this happens to occur from a gimmick used by the grandson of a woman I ended a relationship with, who very loudly told me she would get me back. Slim, no offense, but I think this tragic situation has gotten you and you've lost it," Barney confirms. "I am so sorry this happened. I'm going to go check on Road Rage and figure out what happened." Barney rushes to his car to drive after the ambulance that has taken Road Rage to the hospital. Before driving off, he grabs the canopic jar from his bag and looks it over for an answer. He then reaches into his bag again and pulls out the card with the name that was tied to it and inspects that. He notices it is thicker than one piece of paper and realizes it's a folded up note. He unfolds it and reads, "Dear Barney, this is not your fault, but that damn Slim. I told him I would." Barney curses to himself and drops his head.
Attention Shade Chronicle podcast listeners. The merchandise store is now open. You can find the merchandise store on the merchandise tab on the Shade Chronicles website, which is at theshadechronicles.com. Find premium t-shirts, hoodies, tank tops, travel mugs, ball caps, and more at the Shade Chronicles podcast merchandise store. We now resume your regular programming. Previously on the Shade Chronicles. As she slept, her dreams were a mixture of recent memories. It replayed events surrounding when the mysterious government officials arrived at her luxurious home in Kensington, UK, in the middle of the night 2 days ago. "Ananya, my name is Dr. Clark. I am a scientist, not a medical doctor. My specialty is biology. I am a member of the European Academy of Sciences and Arts. I have been assigned to a very important mission. I would not be exaggerating to say it is the most important work I have ever done. And that brings us to why we are here with you. I know this may sound strange or even impossible to believe, but it is true. We are here because we need your help. We have discovered that you, Ananya, have been singled out and identified as possessing unique qualities that we can utilize in this historic meeting of two worlds. The Visitor by Lawrence Trokey, Part 2. A bump in the road caused Ananya's head to bounce, and that woke her from the drug-induced sleep. She was disoriented at first, looking around the interior of the luxury sedan for clues as to where she was. It was raining outside, and the car was in motion. She could tell she was in a city, but she did not recognize the buildings or the streets. It was only a few hours since she left her room, and still 2 days before she would get on the Chinook in Austria. She noticed she was sitting in the back seat of the sedan with Dr. Clark next to her. The female soldier who had packed her bag was riding in the front passenger seat, and one of the men in suits from her room was driving. The road they traveled on was empty except for a line of sedans in front of them and behind them. It was still dark, and the headlights of the vehicles behind theirs provided some light inside their sedan. Dr. Clark noticed Ananya was awake, and he smiled at first. Then he thought better of it. His face became serious, and he said, "How are you feeling, Ananya?" She started to speak, but her voice cracked. She cleared her throat and said, I'm thirsty." The doctor handed her a bottle of juice from one of the cup holders, and she opened the bottle and sipped the juice. It was apple, her favorite. "Is that better, or do you require anything else?" Dr. Clark looked over his glasses at her. The look seemed to indicate that she was in trouble or something to that effect. "No," she said softly. "Ananya, I want to be very clear now. Your parents have given us permission to have you assist us in the mission I spoke to you about in your room. I have explained the nature of the mission and tried to impart to you the importance of us working together. It is imperative that you cooperate to the best of your abilities for the rest of our time together. We cannot have any more dissent or hesitation in your willingness to help us. Is that understood?" Dr. Clark delivered this speech without looking at Ananya. His eyes were fixed forward on the road ahead through the windscreen. "You drugged my mother. I doubt she agreed to anything you said," Ananya said defiantly and angry. "We did that to keep her safe. When she had a chance to calm down, we discussed the details with her as we did you. Although hesitant, she did finally agree to allow you to help, just as I mentioned your father did. Now, can we say with confidence that you are here at the behest of your parents?" Dr. Clark's annoyance displayed in his sarcastic tone, which was rare for him. He preferred to be more direct in his meeting usually. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, ignoring Dr. Clark's explanation, which she thought was a lie. She didn't think her mother would ever agree to something this outrageous. Her stepdad, though, just might. He tended to respect authority and would want to be cooperative. "We will discuss that and a great many other issues in good time. But first, I must know you understand and will cooperate with me and my work. The future of our world depends on it. Do you understand?" Dr. Clark sounded as though his patience was wearing thin. Ananya decided not to push the boundaries any further. "I understand, and I will cooperate," Ananya said quietly into the glass of the door as she avoided making eye contact with Dr. Clark. It was a struggle for her to verbally acknowledge his authority, her defiance displayed in a subtle act of rude behavior by not looking at him when she answered. "Very well then." Dr. Clark removed his glasses to clean them. The routine act had a calming effect which he needed now. Teenagers and their inconsistent and abrupt behavior were not something he felt quite qualified to deal with. "We will proceed to the next phase of our mission. We are headed to a research center in London to run some tests and prepare you for your first encounter with the alien entity." 30 minutes later, the sedan pulled off a main road and went down a long drive to stop at a heavily fortified checkpoint. Barricades and soldiers armed with high-powered weaponry guarded the entrance to the research center. The next 2 days were a blur of activity for Ananya. When she did finally get time to rest, it was in a small room that seemed to be more like a detention cell than a guest room. Her sleep was fitful and restless. During the day, she was scanned, measured, weighed, interviewed, tested, both physically and mentally, and so on. She had no time alone except after she had been escorted to her room for the night to rest. There was always someone with her, and Dr. Clark was never too far away either. There really didn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to the scientists' tests and procedures, other than they were all centered on learning everything they could about Ananya in every conceivable way. Particularly unpleasant were the gathering of samples of various body fluids. Initial protests were rebutted by Dr. Clark, who continued to remind her of the mission and its importance to mankind. He also did not hesitate to bring up Ananya's parents and the consent they supposedly gave to Dr. Clark. When Ananya finally boarded the helicopter in Innsbruck, she was mostly submissive and cooperative, having been worn down by the grinding schedule of the last 48 hours. Sleep came fairly easily, and she was quickly lulled into it by the drone of the helicopter's engines and the relatively smooth ride. The female soldier gave her a heavy, down-filled military-style jacket for the ride to help keep her comfortable, and it acted like a very cozy sleeping blanket for her during the flight. She wore noise-canceling headphones that were also connected to the internal communication system, which allowed passengers and the pilots to talk over the roar of the engines. Nearing the end of the trip, Ananya began to wake and caught part of the conversation between Dr. Clark and another scientist, who introduced himself to her earlier, but she had forgotten his name. She pretended to sleep so she could eavesdrop on their conversation, and they paid little attention to her while they spoke. Dr. Clark was reviewing a report on the clipboard, flipping back and forth through pages.
So there was nothing then?
He asked his colleague, Dr. Liu. Dr. Liu leaned in and looked down at the clipboard, occasionally pointing to a chart or a test result.
Nothing conclusive. Nothing out of the ordinary or extraordinary. She is a healthy 14-year-old girl of Indian descent, of average height and weight. Very intelligent, but not off the charts so. A product of typical upper-middle-class environment. We could not find nothing in the data to explain why she was chosen over anyone else on the planet. What about social and family connections? Anything unusual there?
Dr. Clark addressed the question to one of the men in suits that had been with Dr. Clark from the beginning. He was seated next to Ananya, across from Dr. Clark and Dr. Liu facing them.
No, sir. Her mother and Ananya are transplanted from Manipur, India. They immigrated to England when the girl was 5 years old after her father was killed. The result of an anti-India insurgency in Manipur.
The insurgency he referred to is one that has fought for Manipur's independence from India for over a half century after the king of Manipur decided to join India in 1949.
Ananya's family is from the Rajput clan, who are majority members of the People's Liberation Army of Manipur, one of several groups fighting against India's rule. Although her father was not involved in the insurgent group, he was caught in the crossfire during a police action against suspected PLA members back in 2009.
Ananya had to bear down on her emotions at the mention of her father, so she wouldn't give herself away to the men. She missed him very much, even still today. He was a kind and gentle man who always had time for her, and he was very patient with her. She loved him very much and was devastated by his death. It was one of the reasons her mother took her from India, to try to get her away from a place that would constantly remind them of her father. So avoiding talking about him or even thinking about him was how her mother and she decided to cope with the trauma of his loss. Occasionally, when she did allow her thoughts to dwell on her father, it usually resulted in a period of depression that would last sometimes for days.
Ananya and her mother moved to England, where they applied for refugee status, and it was granted. They had no family or connections in England, and it was that way for a couple of years. Then Ananya's mother met and married investment banker Reginald Taylor. That was in 2011. Most of the family and friends connections Ananya has are on Mr. Taylor's side. A search of his side did not reveal anything of note either.
Dr. Clark looked concerned.
This doesn't make any sense.
He removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes with his fingers.
There is nothing in the data to suggest this girl is special or unique, and is no better equipped to be the envoy to our guest than you or I. Yet she was singled out by it to be the one to continue the dialogue with the entity. And we still don't even know how it knows about Ananya's existence in the first place.
He flipped vigorously through the pages of the clipboard, hoping to discover an answer to his questions that he may have overlooked previously. He was about to go on with his rant when he noticed Ananya was awake. Instead, he addressed her.
You nearly missed your first helicopter ride, Ananya. We have almost arrived at our destination. Oh, I guess I was pretty tired,
she replied sheepishly. Her mind was rewinding back through everything she had heard the men discussing about her. So Dr. Clark lied about the gifts he claimed she possessed, the reason he told her they had come to get her in the first place. She wondered what else he was lying about, if there was really anything special about her. She was also very freaked out about this alien choosing her over everyone else. Dr. Clark was speaking to her again.
When we land, we will need to run a few more tests, and then we will move on to the next stage of our mission. Is that when I will meet the alien?
She asked.
Let's just say visitor instead of alien. We don't want anyone to get the wrong idea or panic.
He gave her a patronizing smile and then went on.
And yes, we will make contact then. We, of course, will be monitoring you the whole time, so there is nothing to fear. You aren't afraid, are you?
He asked, hoping to head off any potential problems with this alien envoy.
No, I'm fine,
she lied. To be continued next time on the Shade Chronicles podcast. Okay, so that's the end of episode 7, and we're going to talk about the stories in the episode. First is Gorilla Position by Derek Leftridge. And I got to say, Derek, right off the bat, I am just like, wow, this title, Gorilla Position, when I first saw it come up in the list of stories that we're going to be working on, I'm like, where is he going with this? What is Gorilla Position? I have no idea. And then what I love about stories that do what you did as far as taking the name of the title and incorporating it into the story, it really is a thing in the story in terms of the industry and the area that we're talking about. So it matters and it makes sense. But at the beginning, you're like, what is Gorilla Position? What's it? If you have no background in wrestling and the whole culture and that kind of thing, you don't know what that means. I love the way that's incorporated. I strive myself personally to write stories that have titles that are meaningful to the story and only hit it some of the time. So well done.
Thank you. Yeah, the story was written per the name. So I knew I wanted the name the way it was. You've mentioned that before, too. You wrote your story around your name. Mm-hmm. And the names are good. And I had that idea. And a little bit of history here. The Gorilla Position was named after his character name was Gorilla Monsoon. He was a wrestler, but he became an agent, and if I get this wrong, my wrestling brethren, I'm sorry, but he was someone that would sit by the curtain where they would come out, and he was someone that would be in communication with the wrestlers and stuff like that. So that's why they kind of named it that. However, I did kind of define it as when fantasy meets reality. I mean, you come through the curtain, you're your character. You go back through the curtain, you're yourself again. And I wanted it to be two different worlds separated in that sense, be it the show of wrestling and then the real life in the back. And then I wanted to add a little disgusting horror, which I liked, and I put that in there. And I did have a background with the character being, because in my life, my grandfather was pretty much the big wrestling fan for me, but my grandmother also liked it, and when we would go, she would be the one that would be all into it, as opposed to my grandpa, who for some reason every time he was there got beer spilt on him. But anyway, so yeah.
See, that shocks me, because I mean, I don't know that side of your grandmother.
Right.
I know your grandmother and spent a lot of time around her at her house, that kind of thing. I had no idea she was that big time into wrestling.
When she watched sports, I mean, when she got older, which was kind of funny, she would watch hockey, and she would get into it. When they scored a goal, she'd be yelling in the kitchen, and then later on, they'd show a replay of it, and she's like, they did it again! It's like, no, it's a replay, Graham. But no, she was the one that was very emotional, very verbal about sports, be it baseball big time, because that's what it was.
Wow.
But then football when the Cardinals were in St. Louis, and then hockey with the Blues, but wrestling when I would watch it, or we would go to an event. She took me on a Christmas day one time. Her and I were sitting up in the rafters. I have no idea why. There was so many seats down below, but anyway, I guess it was cheaper.
Was this at the old barn, or was this at...
No, this was in North Carolina, actually.
North Carolina. Yep. Well, that's a whole different deal.
That was really cool. So I've always been a wrestling fan, loved it. Been a big fan of it. Grew up in St. Louis with wrestling at the Chase, then went to North Carolina, grew up with it, and I wanted to make a story that had kind of a connection to the past, and this story does have a connection to some other stories that have happened and will be coming up this season. That's enough of that. You'll know more later.
Sure.
But I'm kind of getting some stuff together there, character-wise, positioning certain things. But yeah, I wanted to make a wrestling story, and I wanted it to be called Gorilla Position, and I wanted it to be, to the point that it was pretty intriguing, but then also had that twist at the end.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and that poor guy. Help me out with the wrestler's name.
It was his real name's Barney.
Yeah.
But it was Marcia Tententu. I can't say it now.
Yeah.
You did this to me on purpose.
No.
Where'd I put the paper at? Oh, hold on a second. I hate you so much. Marshu Tentu.
Right, but that's not who I was talking about.
Yeah.
The guy who got the liquid in the face, and then his face melted, basically. Road Rage Mac. Road Rage Mac.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that guy. I mean, that
struggle
was
for that.
Disgusting when you
that was
really revealed what happened, and this wrestler Barney, who's I guess he's just not. He's kind of like the rest of us when it comes to our daily lives with working and things like that. He's kind of feeling the burnout, and he's not really into his job anymore, at least not the thing that he's doing.
Right.
He needs to be reinvented. He needs to be inspired, and that's why he goes on this mission to help him build a new persona for this new wrestler. And I'm sorry, pronounce the name again.
Marshu
Tentu, which has this Egyptian, this whole Egyptian motif about him,
Right.
the ancient pharaohs, that kind of thing, and then the Coptic. Am I saying this? right?
Canopic
Canopic
jar,
get that in
which
there.
is
Yeah.
which is usually decorated as some type of Egyptian imagery or something to that effect. But it would hold the organs of the person that passed away in it, and it was he was really tight with his grandmother, and he always heard that he was Egyptian from her, which I made fun of it because it wasn't really that.
Right.
And then he took that character on and made it what he made it, and was not happy with what he was doing.
Yeah.
And that's a big thing, I think, with a lot of what I've understand with wrestling is that there's a lot of character stuff. And so he went that route and was able to make this character what it was, and it was actually going well, and then it just crapped the bed.
Right, because somebody had other plans and wanted their revenge from the grave.
Yes, exactly.
That was crazy. So you got the ghost story going there, you got the horror and all that kind of stuff. I just was really intrigued by it. And plus, we're seeing another world that usually doesn't come up in horror stories or sci-fi stories, that kind of thing, with the wrestling stuff. So that was a nice little diversion from the typical routine kind of thing. So well done with that, with having the originality to incorporate that into the story.
Well, thank you. Well, we got the next story that is the second part of The Visitor. First off, it's now becoming a scary child abduction.
Yes,
and
true.
that is maybe not. I don't know, but apparently from the character Ananya, I'm getting the idea that you have teen daughters.
Yes.
And you have pretty much described how they think and talk and act.
Right.
And as far as this goes, I really like the dialogue in the helicopter, and the research that you did with the technology is really good. So kind of give us some ideas of what you were thinking during this part.
Yeah, so the second part, I wanted it to have a twist, and a surprise. So now we get into a little bit more about these guys researching, well, why did this visitor or alien pick this Indian 14-year-old girl who doesn't really seem to be connected to anything that would matter? Why would they pick her to be the person that continues on with the dialogue, continues on with the conversation? And then they do all of these tests and go to all of this extreme in terms of trying to find out what makes her special, and they can't find anything. And it doesn't make any sense. Why is she picked when there's nothing about her that's extraordinary or different?
Right.
And then she hears that and realizes, oh, these guys are lying to me about why they got me in the first place, or maybe not so much a lie, but it's like, wait a minute, what's the whole point of this? Why am I here? And so now she's got to figure out, how do I navigate through the rest of this? If there's no reason for me to be here, but yet I am here because this thing has requested for me, what is coming next?
I got something real quick. It's kind of a thought maybe about the third part. I don't.
Yeah.
I haven't listened to it yet, the third part. But I wonder if there's something to do with the father's death. I'm kind of wondering that as being something. I could be wrong.
Interesting.
And the last thing is, I still don't like the doctor. Go ahead.
Well, and the doctor has some creepiness to him, some creepiness about him, especially as Ananya learns things that he's saying that's not really jiving with what she knows. Yet to be determined how much further that goes. But yeah, so it's kind of this interesting relationship where she has to go along with what's being asked of her by this doctor, yet she also knows, hey, I have to be on the lookout for things that aren't lining up right and be careful going forward. So definitely having some caution and some wisdom about this guy isn't all he's cracked up to be. But yeah, I know you're fishing around there, and
I don't want any answers.
You're
I'm just
definitely
saying.
in the pond, let's say.
Okay, I'm in the pond. Well, I just want to say too that, and this might be me being nice to you, which that hardly ever happens, but I really like whenever you do descriptive stuff, and again putting me in the situations to where, because I think that's kind of coming from our comic book background.
Yeah,
kind of thinking that type of thing like that. I try to do that a lot too, and I think this story here is really, really doing that for me.
Great. I appreciate that, and I'm glad you enjoyed it. So that wraps up episode 7, and we're fast approaching our summer break here, but there's still another episode to go, so we're going to give you a little peek at that here in just a second. And again, thank you for joining us and listening. Take care. Next time on The Shade Chronicles.
Kathy was adopted and had a great life growing up. There were a couple of times she tried to contact her real mother, but those attempts did not produce much. In the package were 3 things, which were a letter to Kathy from her real mother, an old skeleton key, and an old wedding ring. The letter, written in what she assumes is her mother's handwriting, has detailed what she needs to do. Kathy is to take the key and ring to the Last Bazaar antique shop on Lincoln Street in the town of Asdale, which is located 55 miles from her home. Inside the store, Kathy sees multiple rows of shelves from floor to roof, and they are all crammed from the bottom shelf to the top with various antiques. Startled, Kathy looks up at the shelves on the left of the aisle, and between an Egyptian artifact and a deck of playing cards with a ratty purple ribbon around them, there is a bluish-colored box that amazingly has her name on the tag that is attached to it.
The military jeep drove to the gate of the security entrance. The driver flashed an ID and submitted his face for a retinal scan before the heavily armed guard gave the jeep clearance to proceed through the gate. Inside the jeep, Ananya sat next to Dr. Clark, while Lieutenant Mitchell, the female soldier traveling with Ananya for most of her trip, sat in the front passenger seat next to the driver. The jeep pulled up to another security checkpoint, but this time the driver parked the jeep and everyone got out. Ananya, this is as far as I'm allowed to go with you. From here you will continue this path for several meters in this direction, and then you will meet with the visitor. As she came closer, she felt a wave of static electricity pass over her, making her hair on her arms stand up and even lifting some of her hair on her head. Then it was gone. She hesitated to move again, but she knew Dr. Clark would chastise her if she did not. The scenery changed instantly to that of her bedroom. She was sitting on her bed with no idea how she got there. She started to feel queasy and a bit lightheaded when her mother came into her room. "Ananya," she said in that way mothers call their children when they want their attention, sweetly but with an undertone of authority. "Are you awake, child?" Thanks again for listening to The Shade Chronicles. For comments or inquiries, you can contact us at shadechron@gmail.com. That's SHADECHRON@gmail.com. Visit us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can also get more information at theshadechronicles.com. The Shade Chronicles podcast is the creative property of Derek Leftridge and Lawrence Trokey. Stories in this podcast were the sole creation of Derek Leftridge and Lawrence Trokey, respectively. Any attempt to replay for broadcast or distribution portions of any episode of The Shade Chronicles without the prior written consent from the creators and/or significant compensation is strictly prohibited. Shame on you for even thinking about it in the first place. Thanks again for listening. Tune in next time for another episode of The Shade Chronicles.